So why are we here is probably the bigger question. And I think for as many of you can appreciate, under the present circumstances, there's quite a need for brands to be able to kind of evolve, change and plan in the kind of coming months ahead. And we've found that a lot of the time these changes are unnecessarily lengthy, probably unduly complex, and pretty expensive for brands. And from our experience, we know that doesn't need to be the case, that brands can develop and change and evolve in a more agile, kind of more budget friendly, greater impact point of view. And we wanted to share some of our kind of experience and suggestions about how we might do that. So I think one of the common things that is really quite kind of, I suppose, apparent at the moment is that brands are realizing that investing in proper understanding of their customers is something that's very important. Without knowing the whys of behavior, you're not able to pivot to the needs of your customers. And I think those brands that have already done so seem to be faring quite well at the moment under the present circumstances, if we can describe it that way. And those who haven't so much are probably struggling a little bit more. So the added problem with that is obviously finding agencies and people you can work with who can fully understand those insights and are able to deploy and action them. And that kind of leads very nicely to why we've kind of partnered really between Innovation Bubble and Duke Creative, in the fact that on one hand, we have the psychologists who kind of leverage the kind of insights in terms of the customer decisions and their needs and how we might better engage them, how we might be relevant to them, how we maintain relationships with them. And then we have the Duo Creative team who are able to kind of help brands action these in an agile way. So how they kind of enact change and help their teams kind of develop through these insights. So we wanted to kind of create a one-stop shop really to help brands move in a much more budget-friendly, agile way, given what we're kind of obviously experiencing right now. And that's why we kind of decided to put this mini-series together really, to show you that proper insights are worth their weight in gold, and that, properly actioning these insights in terms of brand development needn't be lengthy, it needed to be complex, and it surely shouldn't be painfully expensive. So with that in mind, I'll hand over to Lauren, who will kind of kick us off really in terms of what does that actually mean?
Thank you very much, Simon. I feel like I'm a bit on like a newsroom, to be perfectly honest, but let's see how we go or how we fare. But as Simon mentioned, we put together this sort of whistle-stop tour event series that will cover 4 different topics over the next 4 weeks. Today we're very much going to be looking at environment and understanding the change of the environment over the last couple of months. From here, next week we'll be talking more intrinsically about audience needs, responding to the emotions that have fundamentally changed with what's happening in the world at the moment, and how this impacts both brand narrative and channel roles and responsibilities. So today is very much focused on just thinking or setting the scene a little bit more in terms of understanding what change fundamentally means to brand, because once you understand that, everything else becomes that much clearer. So in a short, sharp session, we're going to just touch on landscape, how it's changed, the effects for both brands and consumers, and the considerations of what we can start to take forward when we talk about pivoting towards brand change. So with that in mind, stating the blaringly obvious is that it's under no illusion that COVID-19 has created a huge level of difficulty worldwide over the last couple of months, with business closures, restructuring on a mass level, economic and financial uncertainty, and this increase in sort of fear-mongering emotions. And for those of us who are working within businesses or brands, we've been faced with this sort of proverbial battlefield that has sort of come about in what feels like to us like an elongated period of time, but actually has only been about 3 months, which is incredibly short in all considering. What's happening now is that we are constantly going through this sort of disruptive and constant change management, which means that any actions or anything that we look to do has to be consistently reevaluated to ensure that it meets the new demands of tomorrow. What we have seen happen over the last couple of weeks is that lifestyle for everybody has changed. We've gone from being everywhere to being kind of forced in our homes, or kind of told to stay at home, which has changed our movements and our actions that we deliver every day. We have had our professional lives change from being very busy to being very free, or vice versa. So our work-life balance is different. There's sort of a blurred line between the two now. Our habits have changed. We've had to create a new normal. Normally we set up new habits because we want to try something out, or we want to create something for ourselves in a more organic way, but we've had to force feed habitual change in a slightly different way over the last couple of months to fit the new normal. We've also seen that our emotions have changed, and how we feel about the situation between different groups of people is somewhat polarizing. So navigating this emotional change has been relatively difficult. And that's why we wanted to talk a little bit today about what we really feel about when we think about the concept of change. We know it's sort of categorized into sort of 3 areas. Fear of the unknown. We don't like not knowing what's about to happen next. We've kind of seen that in this period of lockdown. Navigational issues that come with change. It can be somewhat overwhelming to deal with change. But for those who are a bit more optimistic, we see it as an opportunity. So again, it's just understanding what we really feel, because at the end of the day, we're not only marketeers or brand owners or brand or business marketers. We are also human beings. And again, we need to sort of understand that from a very human intrinsic level to be able to move this forward.
So it was the case before lockdown that some brands really enjoyed being the first pick in consumers' hearts and minds. But post-lockdown, we'll know that this will certainly change. I think consumers have more to consider. And because of that, brands need to start to establish a clearer role in the lives of consumers. Some of you, on the next slide, some of you brand owners or those working within a brand, you've probably already asked yourself a few of these questions. Will my business or brand survive this? Should I be more visible? Should I stop investing in marketing? Or do I create new products and services? There's a barrage of questions that are constantly going around. For those working within brands, it's about looking at how we can explore strategies and see what brands have done to meet the challenge of the lockdown so far. So we're just going to go through a series of what brands have been doing thus far. For example, a lot of brands have been quite opportunistic, and through fear, they've actually rushed out into the marketplace and just tried to sell as much as possible, literally everything in the kitchen sink, thinking if they don't do that, then they won't survive. This is just one tactic a few brands have opted in on. The next tactic is actually just staying quiet and doing nothing. It's actually quite depressing walking down the high street and seeing so many shops closed and having just messages on the front window saying, closed for now until further notice. And I think a lot of brands who do this, they're trying not to be insensitive during the crisis. And they're trying to actually, they think by being quiet is the right strategy to implement. I think one thing that we've noticed is that clear and consistent communication is so critical at this period in time. So having a status of what you think and what you're about during this time is so, so critical. Another strategy some brands have implemented is just saving money. So doubling down on certain things like marketing, for example, minimizing their investments in production, for example. But a lot of them are also starting to think of how can we be more strategic with how we invest with our time and our resource. Others have actually been quite ingenious and actually thought about cleaning up their brand, reinvesting in what their marketing looks like internally. And that could be something that a lot of brands take on going forward post-lockdown as well. And last but not least, a strategy that some and most brands have been forced to do is invest online, having to pivot and transition quite significantly from offline to online, just so they can optimize their brand presence, optimize their relationships with their consumers, and actually potentially bring a new product to market. So we've seen a lot of different ways that brands have kind of opted out in this challenge of COVID-19, but it's interesting to see what will happen in the months to come.
On the flip side, when we think about consumers, the questions are relatively similar, but they're almost existential. How long will this last? Can I support myself and my family financially? Do I need to change my lifestyle? And does this brand still represent me and my needs? It's very sort of emotive-driven questions that we're seeing that sort of fit very much in parallel with what's happening on a brand level. And how this has changed in terms of what consumers are naturally doing is that purchase behavior we've obviously seen have changed. There's been a forced transition to solely online with the high street shut. We've had to force ourselves to be much, much more active and engaged online, even if we haven't done that in the past. We've seen that our relationship with anxiety has changed. And I think the word anxiety or fear related emotions pre-lockdown were kind of thrown around the room with a little with little feeling and little understanding. And now we have a much, much, much more detailed viewpoint of what we mean by anxiety and how this affects what we do in terms of marketing and comms.
Maybe just to add on this, I think unfortunately, because it is such a fear-driven time at the moment amongst consumers, what happens here in the brain is that it becomes a tunnel view, and people are much more tuned towards any kind of threat. So it's really critical to understand what this anxiety stage does in order or for brands to communicate positive messaging or new services and products, because ultimately, and we will talk about this more and more in the next webinar as well, how to respond and how to handle anxiety, especially when you want to introduce something new, because it is actually quite challenging, and how you would need to emotionally respond to that as a brand.
Yeah, I think just to add to that very quickly, the customer mindset now has shifted away from very conscious thought to very non-conscious. When people are stressed and when they don't know what's happening next, they do very intuitive kind of appraisals of things. So very quickly, is it relevant? Because they're dealing with lots of pressure and lots of plates that are spinning. Lauren's already said we're dealing with lots of change. So we don't have a lot of attention to kind of really consider things. So we do very quick, non-conscious, is this relevant to me? Is this not relevant to me? And so it's really, really critical that brands think about how they hook people from this non-conscious perspective. And as Katarina said, we're going to explore this in the kind of coming weeks.
So following from that, we've seen therefore a new demand on brand relationships. Purpose has become a much higher priority to customers than maybe what we gave it credit to before the lockdown. You're almost being judged as a brand a little bit more than you were before. And it's something that people have to get very much behind, even if you have a purpose already, to understand how you emphasize it to ensure that you're meeting the new demand of tomorrow for customers is really, really important. And then seeking connection online, it's a weird thought and sentiment to even say that, you know, social media is even more important now than it was before, but it actually is, because of the fact that we are human beings at the end of the day, and we've been forced into this environment whereby we're not able to connect naturally with people. We have to find other means of doing so, and this means that we have to be, as we'll talk about later on, is be a bit more creative with the way in which we connect with people. And social media has become the new form of social. We're doing it right now. We're sitting on Zoom and we're having a webinar. This is a new standard that has been put in place that we're going to have to get behind quite swiftly. So disruptive change, what this means for us as brands or marketeers. Clear and consistent communication has never been more important. I don't think this is, this is pretty much stating the obvious, but it's harder to actually do than it is to say. We've seen this a little bit with the NHS. You know, we've all been a little bit confused by what the NHS has, well, the governmental messaging has been around the NHS notifications. So what we want to ensure is that whatever we're doing next to inform people moving forward is that it's so unbelievably clear and it meets the attributes and the feelings that people are really going through very gutturally and intrinsically, as Simon and Katarina both said, moving forward into what we're naturally doing at the moment.
A quick example of that, for example, is the kind of social distancing. You know, there's some really awful messages out there about 2 meter distances. What does 2 meters mean? I mean, a lot of people don't even know what 2 meters is. So the brain doesn't like numbers because it has to remember it. It puts stress on it. It'd rather have an image. So I think there is one particular supermarket brand that's actually using images of things that are 2 meters or 6 feet rather than the word or the number 2 feet. And that apparently is working very well. So, you know, to Lauren's point, we have to think about what actually engages the brain under these circumstances more than we did before.
So I think that leads us quite nicely into what it means to be rethinking your strategy during this time. We like to say have an audience first approach. And that simply means where your objectives and activities are centered around a need or an emotion that actually caters to your audience. So like Simon's example, the brain doesn't like numbers. So a brand, for example, has already started thinking of ways of using images to make the message even clearer. So here's where we start to ask questions if we don't know. If we were to look online, you can see screen times are up, with more time being spent indoors. People have been forced to behave and interact in different ways, as Lauren mentioned earlier. Our lives is essentially centered around the news and the internet. People are taking part in dance challenges and workouts from home, working from home, ordering food, shopping online. It's basically become a different kind of mindset. Some brands have been able to capitalize while others have not. Amazon, for example, has recorded 300% in sales increase over the last couple of months. So it's it's like a wild west out there at the moment. If we look at the stats online, we can see that people are still online doing things. They're still searching for things. They're still uploading photos on Instagram, still on Facebook. Life hasn't changed. You just need to understand where people are and what they're doing with their time now. We long for connectivity. We long for being more productive, and we find creative ways to do this. So it's up to the brand to actually establish a clear role in the lives of the consumer and actually find a way to kind of give them what they need.
So this leads us to sort of how we can start thinking about brand change, or how we can pivot as brands. Traditionally, we've always talked about brand houses. You know, this is not, again, new to anyone who's worked in brand positions before in brands and businesses. This is kind of the building blocks of the foundation infrastructure of what we do, how we build out values, our positioning, tone, look and feel, products and services, and what that means in terms of amplification across channels. But again, what we've seen in the last 3 months is very much that we had to start asking some other questions around this in order to transition it from where we have been to where we're going to be going next. And we kind of distilled it down to 3 questions. It's a little bit like asking yourself to recite the AA mantra, you know, give me the strength to change the things I can change and the things I can't. But the questions that we ask ourselves is, what do I stand by? What can I evolve, and what must I change? And the difference between what I can evolve versus what must I change is the fact that what you can evolve is something that's iterative over time, versus what must I change is something that you have to operationally change within your organization and your structure in order to meet this new normal. When we talk about what do I stand by, this normally lends itself very nicely to our brand purpose or values. And, you know, when we talk about purpose, we talk about proposition planning, and the way in which we articulate this is it's a proposition is not about your service or your product. It's an idealistic view of the reason for what your business does. It's much more universal. To give you an example of a proposition that's really taking shape very, very nicely over the course of the last couple of months is Squarespace. Anyone who has engaged or used or has a Squarespace site will understand what they're talking about here is, but they are talking about helping creative ideas succeed. And again, in a time where businesses are struggling, people really need to find other ways to deliver their services. This proposition lends itself super well to this idea of democratizing the idea of online or e-commerce and website builds. It allows it to be very much for the people and very much success driven to ensure that we can continue doing business the way in which we want to do it. And it's followed through really nicely when we talk about values. And again, when we think about value building in relation to the propositions, is that it's not, you know, just words kind of throwing them out on the table, throwing them against the wall to see what sticks. It's very much about what we want to be. It's who we are. And again, in the case of Squarespace, the way in which they tend to sort of talk about value and positioning is that they talk about themselves being customer-centric, striving for excellence, performance-driven, and being very straightforward. And you can see that very much in everything that they say, the way in which they look and the way in which they operate. So again, it's going to be really, really important to revisit the purpose that you've built out, if you have built one. Hopefully you have. Again, this is a process that tends to be shortcutted in a lot of scenarios, and we really believe it shouldn't be. And to interrogate it and to ensure that it works both from where you've come from all the way through to what's going to be happening next.
And message evolution is something that we naturally do with audience development. So, and I think in this time of change, it is even more important to validate messaging to meet this new consumer demand from brands. So one of the key things that you need to think about is what is really appealing to the people, and how do they want to feel. And it's not so much about, which happens a lot in brand work, it's about how do we want to make them feel. It is crucial to understand from what emotional standpoint they are coming from. And just to give you an example, we worked with Virgin Atlantic a couple of years ago, and they were introducing the new economy fares at the time in order to compete with the budget airlines. But at the same time, their fares were still a little bit more expensive. So they needed to be true to their brand, and keep the messaging aligned with their purpose and value, but then at the same time emerge from this with this new proposition. So what we did for them, we did some research, some psychological research into how customers really feel about flying. And it was not so much about what many airlines actually do, is about excitement and this is great and this is fun. What we found was a lot of people just want to get from A to B hassle-free, and it's also quite an anxiety-driven journey people go on. And knowing these underlying emotions that actually drive people's behavior and decision-making when it comes to airlines, what Virgin Atlantic needed to do is to position and to respond to these anxieties that people experience when they go and fly and book online flights online, to say, well, we have many more staff on the ground and on our fleets that can actually take care of any stress points, hassles, things that go wrong where budget airlines, for example, disappear. So knowing from that brand, they could position and highlight the customer service that was consistent and wouldn't go away no matter what kind of economy fare customers would actually choose. And the other thing that they did is, because it's, and there's a parallel now to this crisis as well, because of the anxiety-driven emotion, they gave with the phrase of "be choosy" the control back to the consumers, because they allowed them to choose. But at the same time, they combined it with the fun factor that Virgin Atlantic always plays with "be choosy." It's a little bit more fun than, right, you have control or something, or you choose. So they did it really nicely to combine, respond to the emotional needs of the customers, and combine it still with their purpose and brand. And that then actually led to the most successful marketing campaign they had and the biggest ROI.
Because it aligned up, didn't it, really? Because they were more expensive, but because we found out that non-consciously people travel to get somewhere with as less stress as possible, what you can then say in positioning a brand is, well, we are more expensive because we have more ground staff to actually resolve your problems. And now you've just positioned why it's more expensive. You've given a psychological reason why they're more expensive, and it actually plays against people's needs. Well, actually, I don't mind investing in that, because I do want people to remove my stress. I don't want to go with an airline where actually I've got a problem and they don't have the staff to resolve it. And that worked as well. And we saw customer experience kind of increase as well in terms of flying.
So following on from messaging evolution is when we start asking ourselves about what we have to change. And this is when we ladder it back to channel rules and choices. It's a bit like a blessing and a curse, really, specifically when we talk about online options, because there's such a plethora of choice out there. And this can be, as we mentioned before at the beginning, unbelievably overwhelming to navigate, and people stretch themselves unbelievably thin and try and do everything all at the same time without actually considering what this actually means in terms of role and responsibility across brand and in people's lives. So when we think about this, we have to evaluate current channels. What are you doing at the moment? Is it making sense? Or is there something that you're missing potentially, or something that you could be doing that will enhance the things that you need to be saying or doing to customer experiences? An example of which, not too dissimilar in terms of, talking about disruptive change, is that we worked with Avis Budget Car Hire Group a number of years ago, where during a really peak season, they did a site migration in the UK, and it went down, or something went wrong with the site migration, and it meant that they were going dark to their customers across a time whereby they had the highest level of interest in terms of travel and car hire. So we had to pivot really, really, really quickly to ensure that we could service people with the brand, first of all, and also ensure that we reappear within the search engines in a really, really quick way. So we created an editorial space using seasonality and performance metrics to understand and build relationships with key contributors to build back brand authority within a really short space of time across the travel and tourism sector. And this was a sub-site that then eventually was sort of added to the main brand, UK brand site when it went back online. But it helped become the main source of traffic across the migration period, and in turn helped the brand service or surface within search terms that they'd never been applicable before before the site went down. So they actually started to build brand authority in other spaces that they'd never actually tapped into before, and in essence became a central communications platform for all brand content. So just doing something very, very simple and consolidated in a very quick and strategic way across a channel choice really helped them to build back what they had lost, and also set them up to have further successes in the future beyond the site migration, which is quite indicative of what we're seeing at the moment. So in normal circumstances, when we talk about brand pivots in any shape or form, these can take anywhere between 3, 6 or 9 months. And we all have been there, done that, got the postcard, where these have been incredibly overcomplicated processes. And I'm not gonna beat around the bush and tell you everything's a garden of roses, because we've all seen slides in presentations that look like this. Really over analytical, really almost like a science project, and give you a huge amount of terminology to kind of digest really, really quickly. Or they can look like this, you know, where there's 101 steps in order to get to the end point. And we all know very, very well, if we've worked with other agencies before, is that most of these points end up becoming a cost item or a line item within a cost sheet for service. So we also know that in terms of having multiple stakeholders involved, is that we all talk about collaboration and having very over elongated processes to collaborate with. It's more or less a very surreptitious way of saying, be reasonable, do it my way. So we kind of need to think about a new way of working that just kind of cuts the fat really, and just gets to the bare nuts and bolts of this, which is to get you from concept all the way through to completion. Because in essence, if we think about things in a traditional sense, it takes time, and time obviously costs money, which then impacts budget. And if you do something and you have great expectations for it and it doesn't work out in the way in which you had hoped for, it's a risk. So we want to try and limit those that concept of risk in terms of times of change. So in essence, for us as partners or brand partners, is that we have to prepare for a new normal, not only from a brand direction point of view, but also the way in which we operate to deliver brand development. And together with Innovation Bubble, we've been talking about this and been implementing different ways of working, but we have a 4-step process and how we normally tend to structure things. And again, it looks a little bit like the 12 steps to Alcoholics Anonymous, but it's just a really simple 4-step process that takes approximately no more than 3 months. Because anything beyond 3 months, you start to get into slightly sort of tentative waters. So we start with the setup process of a working session, joining the dots between asking some significant questions in terms of teams and infrastructure. That takes no more than 2 days. Again, we don't want to over elongate this process. We have a job to do in order to get as much information together as possible in a very quick period of time. This then lends itself into research and review, which is the consolidation of landscape, audience review, audience testing and planning, and even a digital review to have a look at almost like a hygiene check. From here, this is quite fluid. It then moves us into comms development and validation. This is really, really important that, again, what tends to happen in traditional brand development pieces is that we do a lot of development work, and then we implement, and then we tweak, which then again has a risk in terms of budget and time wasting. So what we tend to do is we validate as much as we possibly can through the development process, from creative and messaging upfront before anything is produced, so that when we get to the production stage, we can hit the ground running really, really quickly. And we've seen this work really, really well in terms of how we can implement from start to finish within a 3-month period of time. So the most important thing for us as a combination of Innovation Bubble and Duo Creative Media is that we validate as much as we possibly can upfront, not after launch. It's really important that we have as much information together before we start doing anything, in order to ensure that we're limiting the idea in time, that limiting the idea on wasting money, and ensuring that what we're doing actually has a meaning. It's not just being done for the sake of doing it. So just to give you some examples of brands who have adopted this way of working, we ran a project with a brand called Loco2, who were a train ticket provider, not too dissimilar to the Trainline. And we were brought in to do a very quick project around changing proposition look and feel. Their issue was that they were being bought out by a larger corporation with a number of similar brands under the same umbrella. So again, what they had to do was stand out both externally with the competition, but also internally. So they had to find a new angle to approach their communications with. So the answer was very simple: develop an identity that they could own before they were bought out by another company. And so following that kind of 4-step process, we did exactly that. We went from working session to audit, review and research, comms, process and testing, all the way through to production. And this really set them up in a way that they could then take this further, deliver it across channel, deliver it across campaigns in a very consolidated way without wasting time or budget. And it proved to them to have a really clear message across everything that they were saying and doing. So that was just giving you an idea. This was all done in 2.5 months. So you can imagine the amount of sort of running and pivoting that had to be done really, really, really quickly.
And then many people also assume that implementing insights from an audience perspective needs actually a lot of time. And again, when we do our insight work, it can actually be done between 3 and 6 weeks. And then for implementing it or giving this back to Duo Creative, as Lauren said, it doesn't need to take months and months. All these projects can be done within 3 months' time. So to give an example, a classic example, what Lauren was alluding to already, Alimera Sciences, which is a pharma company, they launched a new drug in the market at the time, which was really new. It was aimed at patients with an edema in the eye, which could cause blindness. And the drugs at the time in the market were monthly injections into the eyeball with appointments that took 1 hour for the patients and the doctors. And they thought, well, nobody wants an injection into the eyeball. We need to save doctors and patients time. And hence, let's go with the messaging of this drug lasts up to 36 months. You only need 1 injection. That's it. And you don't need to see your patients that often anymore. And they didn't hit the sales whatsoever as they wished for. And they didn't understand why. So they came to us and we did some audience research. And what we actually found, coming back to our key message really to you about understanding the emotional needs where people are coming from more than ever today, is in this case, patients had a very strong need for reassurance. Actually, when you're facing blindness, you care less about losing your, getting a monthly injection into the eyeball, you care about keeping sight. So they needed reassurance. The doctors wanted to reassure the patients as well, making sure that there are no side effects. And hence the underlying emotion was reassuring people and understanding from an emotional perspective where they're coming from. So what you can see here on the slide at the bottom, this was then what Alimera changed from a much more emotional perspective, understanding and mirroring the patients, that it is about seeing and imagining that this new drug could help them finally not only to not lose their sight, but actually to see more than they could before. And comparing that, what you see in the top of the screen is a typical competitor, which has very pragmatic functional messaging, goes straight into treatment path, and it's just about the drug. So again, understanding from an emotional perspective where your audience comes from and then responding accordingly. And this then led to 16% increase in sales.
So to summarize the things that we've sort of alluded to in this very short session, is that there's sort of 4 things that we hope that you can take away with you. Is that the first is that we know that there has been a change to consumer environments. We know that people are living slightly different lives now than they were 3 months ago. So we have to start adhering to that. And it's easy to say it, but it's much harder to do because we are creatures of habit and we like to sort of kind of stick to our own ways of doing things. The other thing that we really sort of implore people to think about is don't try to reinvent the wheel, try and evolve it, because again, you already have you already have a base to start from, and reinventing something costs time and money. Evolving something in a much more sort of methodical way will really help shift the dial, even on a small level, to ensure that you're meeting the new demand. We also think prepare brand for beyond the lockdown. Again, we've seen that the lockdown restrictions are starting to change and starting to be lifted. That does not mean necessarily that things will go back to the way in which they were before. I highly doubt it. In any case, that they will return to normal for a very, very, very long time. So therefore, anything that you're doing now, anything you're thinking about doing now needs to be thinking about the long term for what the new brand world might look like for you and for everybody else. And I think most importantly is give yourself a time frame. Again, it's really easy to revert back to old ways of doing things in brand, to kind of following a very, very, very detailed process of going through all the nuts and bolts. But the more structured you can be in terms of giving yourself a time frame from concept to completion, the better off you'll be in terms of actually getting things out to the world and understanding what that change looks like for your customers. So I think just these might sound obvious, they might not, but again, these are the sort of things that we've been chatting to brands and customers about, and seeing what they feel and how they feel about the current situation, and how we can then start to answer those needs even as a brand partner. So with that in mind, we wanted to open the floor to any questions that you may have.
Yes, so please feel free to just unmute yourself and shout out your questions, or you can also submit your questions in the chat if you like. We're happy to address them now.
Unless there's no questions and everything was super, super clear or super obvious to everyone. So
no, so far, no questions. Yeah.
Okay.
Then we can, I think we will send this around as well. If you want to distribute that to anyone, it will go online and in our social media channels as well. If you have any questions or follow-ups, then we are normally more than happy to jump on a 20-minute chat and just listen to you, what's on your mind, what you're thinking about your brand. And we can give you some feedback there and then. And then we normally start with a bespoke workshop for you and your teams to address the brand pivots. And Lauren, did you want to say anything else?
No, all I wanted to sort of iterate was next week, obviously this was very much about landscape and just sort of setting the scene. Next week, it's going to be much more about audience emotions and audience need states and how we address them creatively. So same time next week, same on Thursday, we'll be going through, again, another short session to talk you through how we approach audience needs. And we hope that we'll hope to see you there.
We have one question.
Oh.
I think in that session next week we'll explore.
Thanks very much, Catherine.
Go to the non-conscious, why people's mindsets have changed from things like gain to kind of maintain. So there's lots for brands to kind of consider here, because I think, as you're suggesting, Lauren, it's not going to be the same even in the mindsets of the customers now.
No, not at all.
Great. Then thanks very much, Rachel and Catherine, for your comments, and we see you next week.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.